Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Boy versus Bacteria with Rock the Bacteria. And hopefully that gives you a good clue that today we'll be talking about bacteria, and actually all sorts of microbes in general. And this is something that you might already know about. You might have seen this coming if you follow our Twitter feed, because I sent out a couple of posts recently, because actually there's been this explosion of microbe interest in the world, and there have been posts about some microbial art that has come out, and also some recent scientific findings that were quite interesting about various microbes, including bacteria. So this is quite a hot topic, and actually the whole reason I thought I would talk about this today was that I have a recent issue of National Geographic that has a whole section in it about why we explore, and one of the things that it talked about was why we're exploring increasingly small places as well as large spaces. So not only are we going out into outer space and to the depths of the oceans and to these huge, big environments that we've not been to before, but we're also looking within. And one of the things that we're looking at is the huge number of species that are living within us in the little microenvironments in our bodies. And of course, one of those groups of species is the microbes. And so I'd like to read a bit of that article today because it's really nicely written and it's quite interesting, and I think it shows you why it is that bacteria and other microbes can be so exciting. So this is written by Dr. Nathan Wolfe, who is a microbiologist at Stanford University in the US. And this is from the 2013 issue, January 2013 issue of National Geographic, which may still be out there for you to buy if you want to read the whole article. So here he goes. Breathe in. Feel the air pass through your nostrils and move into your nose. Your diaphragm contracts, pulling the air deep into your chest. Oxygen floods into tiny cavities in your lungs and travels into your capillaries, ready to fuel every cell in your body. You are alive. So is that breath you just took. When we inhale, our nostrils capture millions of invisible particles. Dust, pollen, sea spray, volcanic ash, plant spores. Those specks in turn host a teeming community of bacteria and viruses. A few types may trigger allergies or asthma. Far more rare are inhaled pathogens that are themselves the agents of diseases such as SARS, tuberculosis, and influenza. Over the past 15 years, I've spent a lot of time poking cotton swabs up human noses, pig snouts, bird beaks, and primate proboscises, looking for signs of such agents before they cause deadly pandemics. As a result, I've come to think of air as the medium for the next pandemic, rather than the means to sustain life. But breathe easy. Most of the microbes in the air do us little or no harm, and some almost certainly do us good. The truth is, we still understand precious little about them. We have known about bacteria, which make up much of the mass of life on Earth, only since Antony van Leeuwenhoek began training his microscopes on samples of pond water and saliva some 350 years ago. Viruses, much smaller than bacteria but far more numerous than all other life forms combined, were discovered not much more than a century ago, when people were already driving around in automobiles. And it is only in the past few decades that we have come to realize how ubiquitous microbes are, flourishing from the tops of clouds to miles below the Earth's surface. We've just begun to understand how vital they are to our health and to the health of the Earth. We pride ourselves on having explored nearly every corner of this planet, but behind our world is a shadow world of microbes, and they are often calling the shots. So if you're just joining us, that again was an excerpt from the most recent issue of National Geographic. It's written by Dr. Nathan Wolfe, who is a microbiologist at Stanford University and obviously also quite an excellent writer. And I think what I like the best about this, besides the fact that it gives you this really broad understanding of just where microbes are, or rather the fact that they are everywhere, it also emphasizes that there are only a small number of them, relatively speaking, that are actually quite bad and do negative things to us. But there are also lots and lots more that are quite positive or neutral and don't harm us in any way. And so one of the things I want to try to talk about today is the cool things that microbes do that are not necessarily kind of scary and intimidating and bad for us, but just the neat things they do out in the environment and why it is that maybe we should appreciate having these guys around us. So first of all, I'll start with the microbes within, because as Nathan Wolfe said, we do have tons and tons of microbes within us in our ecosystem of a body, and they're found in various different parts. So actually, amazingly enough, we have about 10 times as many microbes within our body as we do our own cells. So if you were to pull out a cell at random, 1 in 10 of these would actually be us, and the other 9 would be another organism that's just on the scale of our own cells. And there are about 300 times as many bacterial genes as there are human genes. So clearly, even though we think of ourselves as humans, we are walking around dominated by the little things that live on and inside us. So these things include bacteria, viruses, fungi, and other microorganisms like diatoms, for example, which I'll mention again later. And if you were to gather all these things up together from our bodies and weigh them separately, they weigh in at approximately 3 pounds, which is equivalent to the mass of our brains. So that's something that's quite interesting to think about next time you think that we humans are all high and mighty and so advanced that actually quite a significant proportion of us is other organisms. So, as I said earlier, we are an ecosystem, and the various parts of our bodies are as different as the different ecosystems through which we move here on Earth. So we've got things as diverse as, as deserts and the Arctic within our own bodies, and that's also what we see when we look at the microbes themselves that live there. So just like we have things like lions versus fish versus eagles, we have all sorts of microbes that look very different from each other and function very differently and go about their lives in quite a different manner. And actually the variation that we see can happen over quite small distances. So the example that Wolf gives in his National Geographic essay is that there has been a recent study of the bacteria that are found in our mouths. And researchers have actually found that from one little pocket of gum on one tooth to the next one, you can have as much variation as you would find from one section of your body to another. So even though all these microbes are found within our mouths, they still can be hugely different just from one tooth to the next. And the researcher who was talking about this compared our teeth to like little islands living in the ocean. That's how different they are. They're quite distant from each other on bacterial terms. So where do we get all of these microbes to begin with? And that might make you feel a bit dirty, but actually it's not because you haven't washed up enough. This is actually something that we have had for years and years and years before you even had the capability to try to get yourself rid of any sort of thing that would live on or in you. So researchers used to think that we first were exposed to these microbes during birth. So when babies are born naturally and they come out of the vaginal canal, they pick up bacteria that are there within their mothers, and they're there for a reason, or at least our bodies haven't combated them for a reason. Because these bacteria, which are in the group Lactobacillus, they can facilitate milk digestion. So we have evolved very closely with these things, and they help us as we come out and are separated from our mothers to be able to ingest and get nutrients from the milk that our mothers produce for us. And actually C-section babies, they're pulled out immediately and they don't get a chance to pick up those bacteria. They often have a hard time taking milk at first. They have to build up their bacteria before they're able to do this. And they also often have much more of the harmful bacteria that they pick up from adult skin. So this is because they're pulled out through their mother's abdominal cavity, so they get the things that she has there, but also they're handled by the doctors. And of course the doctors are wearing sterilized gloves and everything, but there are bacteria that are hanging out in the room and they pick those up instead. But actually, recent research shows that this is not the only place that we get bacteria, and in fact we might start to accumulate these microbes quite early on, even while we're still within our mothers. And in particular, it's the gut biome that we start to pick up while we're in the womb. So this appears to come to us along with the nutrients that our mothers send us through the umbilical cord. And so even before we are born, we have the bacteria within us that allow us to start taking in the food that our parents give us once we are out of the womb. And on that thought, thinking about all the microbes that we have within us, I'm going to have a bit of a break for some music. And this will be Claude Astier of Les Frères Saccharine singing Le Bal des Microbes. So that, once again, was Claude Astier singing Le Bal des Microbes. And today, obviously, we are talking about microbes here on the wild side. And just before the break, I was saying that all of us have lots of microbes that we pick up very early on in life. And now you might be wondering a bit more about where are these microbes found. Well, the majority of them are in your gut, and in particular in your large intestine. In fact, we have over 33,000 species, going on 34,000, and those are just the ones that are known. We don't have the most perfect techniques yet for getting a feel on how many bacteria there are in a sample, and that's actually not just a technical limitation, but also kind of a biological one. But we do have an estimate that it is somewhere between 33 and 34,000 different species. And the most important of these is Bacteroides thetaiotaumicron. That's probably a horrible mispronunciation. But this guy is responsible for digesting plant starches and also allowing us to move away from our mother's milk to more solid foods as we get older. So as we begin to age, when we're infants, we will build up more and more of this, and that allows us to move on to solid foods. Now the tongue has just under 8,000 species, and the most common of these is a Streptococcus bacteria, and you're probably familiar with the idea of Streptococcus because some of these guys can be really dangerous, particularly in quite large numbers, and they form these aggregations that are known as plaques. But this particular type of Streptococcus, which is Streptococcus salivarius, is one that helps prevent tooth decay and gum disease and oral infections, and so it is quite useful to us. And the way that it does this is that basically it outcompetes these bad kind of bacteria that want to invade, and so it keeps the bad ones out and takes up all the space with itself, and it's a good one, and so it just doesn't give them any room to put down roots and live in our mouths. And as you might expect, it's not just the tongue that has lots of species, but also the throat, because these things are quite close to each other, they're very closely connected, and we swallow saliva, and that will take some bacteria from our mouths back into our throat cavity. And this actually does still have, though, fewer species than the tongue, so about 4,100. And the major player here is one that is more abundant in babies than in adults, and it might play an important role in facilitating immunity to meningitis when we're quite young. So this, again, is an example of one of the bacteria that we have, one of the microbes, I should say, just in general, that will eventually kind of shift in how much there is and where it's located as we age. And so you can see that there is this shift in bacteria over time depending on the sorts of things that we do and the sorts of conditions that we generate within our body. And that, of course, is going to be a function of the sort of food that we eat and the hormones that are around, and just a whole bunch of different stuff that will change the way that our bodies act as an ecosystem to harbor these different species. Now the other most populous areas, which are the vaginal opening, the inner elbows, behind the ears, the nostrils, all of these have about 2,000 to 22 bacteria, more or less. And many of the dominant species here are, like the ones on your tongue, important for keeping invasive bacteria in check. So again, even though you might feel kind of grimy knowing that you have 2,000 species of bacteria, and who knows how many different individuals, actually they're doing quite a nice thing in keeping the worst ones from settling on top of you. Now the majority of microbes in our body are either neutral or beneficial. So one of the big things they do is help us digest food. And in particular, we need lots of help with fiber. And we're actually not the only organism for which this is true. There are lots of other species, particularly mammals, things like ruminants, that need help digesting these really tough fibers. And if we didn't have these guys, we would just take in these things and then excrete them in pretty much the same form. We would not be able to break them down physically. We would not be able to get out the nutrients that we do. And in fact, you can classify these things depending on what kind of function they have in your stomach. And these are called enterotypes. And enterotypes just mean what it is that they're doing when they're down there in your gut. And this, again, is going to differ depending on what type of food you eat. So you'll have more or less of these depending on what sort of diet you have. So the three main groups are ones that kind of target animal fats and carbohydrates and plants, or kind of combinations of those. And if you go around the world, you'll find that different people from different cultures will have different balances of these, as well as individuals within that culture. So here in the West, we tend to have lots of the organisms that are good at doing animal fats and carbohydrates, because we tend to have diets that are quite high in that. But elsewhere, where you have people eating more plant material, more fruit material, you'll have a different type of bacteria aggregation in the stomach. These things also, not only do they help digest the food and break it down so it's in little nutrients that we can then absorb, but they also help us actively absorb those nutrients. So they make the things available to us and then help us take those up into our cells as well. They also manufacture some of the things that we can't make. And this includes vitamins like thiamine and riboflavin and biotin, which you might know a bit better as B1, B2, and B7. And they can release chemicals from food to make them available to us so that we can absorb them for similar useful purposes. So a good example of this is isothiocyanate, which is a compound that's in broccoli, and it helps prevent cancer. And if we didn't have microbes in our guts, we wouldn't be able to have access to this and take it up so that it can have this beneficial effect in our systems. Now, one kind of interesting thing is that these microbes in our guts in particular, but also throughout our bodies, can provide some immune stimulation. So when they are first introduced, our bodies do recognize that they are a foreign thing, and so they might react to them in some way or another. And it can be quite a low level of stimulation, so it just kind of primes our bodies for the realization that there might be things invading. Eventually we might want to have a good response to that. They might look kind of more or less like these things that have just come in, and so we get some function ready in case we have a worse infection later on. So for example, Helicobacter pylori is something that is actually thought to be quite useful in this. So you know that Helicobacter is responsible for things like ulcers, and it also may be even related to some cancers of the gut, and so it can be quite bad if it gets out of control. But under natural circumstances, when you're eating a normal diet, you're not really stressing your system in any sort of way, H. pylori is actually quite nice for us. And there have been some recent studies that suggest that by stimulating our immune system when we pick these things up when we're young, it can actually help us not have autoimmune responses later on, or responses to other things, other infectious things as they come around. So there's this crazy theory that perhaps the increases in asthma that we've seen in children, especially that are growing up right now, we might see this because their parents have had such a shift in conditions and a change in their stomach and gut conditions that they no longer have as many H. pylori as they used to. And so their parents don't pass on the H. pylori to their young, and then their young don't have this to stimulate their immune system, and all of that leads to the kind of autoimmune dysfunction that leads to asthma. And that's a pretty crazy chain of events. You might never think to link a gut bacterium with a condition that involves breathing, but there is quite a lot of evidence that this might actually be the case. And so researchers are looking into this to figure out if there's some way to maybe help stimulate children when they're young so that later on they don't develop these worse conditions as they age. Now, as I've mentioned already and kind of related to that, the bacteria, one final really important function of these bacteria and other microbes is to outcompete more dangerous invading microbes. And these are things that can range wildly depending on where these organisms are found in your body. So you've got ones that will kill off the things that might otherwise give you food poisoning. You'll have ones that can keep out skin infections. So for example, some of the bacteria on our skin, they excrete this thing that kind of closes up wounds or kind of puts a little bit of a mucousy type substance, but on a very, very small level. And so that will cover up the wound so that other things can't get in the wound instead. So if you scratch yourself and it doesn't end up getting infected, you probably have your skin bacteria to thank for it. And we also see this kind of thing happening with colds and all sorts of other sorts of infections that might happen if we didn't have these guys in us kind of battling it out on a very small scale. Now, one of the things that's received a lot of attention lately in the press, and especially I'm sure you've seen commercials, is probiotics. And probiotics are really popular right now in Northern Europe, in Japan, and increasingly popular in the US and in the UK specifically. And there are lots of clinical studies on these things because, you know, of course, if you have this thing that seems to have a lot of merit, then you're going to be interested in finding out whether, in fact, there is some biological reason why you should be taking this substance. And it has been found that some probiotic treatments do have some worth. So if you take lactobacillus, there is a chance that you will shorten the length of infectious diarrhea, So if you are already feeling ill with infectious diarrhea and you bulk up on the good bacteria instead, then they can get rid of those bad bacteria and shorten the length of sickness that you would otherwise have. But this mostly has been found to work in children rather than in adults. And oddly enough, if you've got this lactobacillus, it can also seemingly help prevent infections with cold bacteria and also shorten infections if you've already got one. So again, here we see this connection between what's in our gut and what happens elsewhere in our body. And some people have suggested that when they take this, it's also helping out with other conditions that were kind of seemingly unrelated to any sort of bacterial situation. So it can maintain remission of ulcerative colitis, prevent the relapse of Crohn's disease, and can help keep irritable bowel syndrome in check. And all of those things are associated with some other more general systemic problems in the body, but because these bacteria kind of keep the situation in the gut the way that it should be, they kind of have a nice natural setting, they keep the pH the way it should be, they keep other bad things out, then it seems to help make the system better able to keep everything in check. And as you might expect, these sorts of things can be quite useful for urogenital health. So you know, if you've ever taken an antibiotic or birth control pills, that sometimes these things can upset your system and cause you to get infections. And if you're not a big fan of something like cranberry juice to help you kind of get rid of the infection, then something like a bacterium that you could just ingest quite easily might be the answer for you. And it seems even to be good in people with autoimmune issues. And obviously you might think this could be a bit scary if you've got people with immune problems to introduce a bacterium, but there is some evidence that even these guys are able to benefit from the bacteria because it creates a more stable environment. However, this is not an advocation that you should go out and have a bunch of these things and expect them to cure everything, because it really depends on what strain is administered, whether you're taking these things as capsules or eating them in your food. And actually much of the research that has been done is just on capsule form, so you're just taking in the raw bacteria. But a lot of the stuff that you see on commercials, people have mixed these things into yogurt or into those kind of fermented milk type drinks that you would ingest, and people aren't sure that those things have the same effects, the pills and the foods. And also you have to consider whether there are other simultaneous immune issues or not that you need to consider. So all of this stuff is definitely worth thinking about, but it's also a really good idea to kind of keep your eye on the literature and see what researchers are finding, and also ask your doctor whether this is actually going to fit in given all the other stuff that you've got going on. Because again, your body is an ecosystem, and so the bacteria might not get along, and they might not like the environment in which they suddenly find themselves if you introduce a bunch into your body. Now it's a good time to mention and to acknowledge just briefly that microbes aren't always good to us. And of course everyone knows that already, but just to give one example, Staphylococcus, which I mentioned earlier, can be quite a nice thing, but sometimes there are bad infections of staph. So Staphylococcus aureus is one of the naughtiest of all of the staph bacteria. And these guys are often found in our nostrils. So if you were to take a random sample of people and swab to see if they have this, about a third of them would, so it's quite a common bacterium. And it's normally benign, but if it's not kept in control by the other stuff that you have in your nostrils, then it can go out of control. And this is something that does happen, unfortunately, not all that infrequently. And so it's responsible for lots of things that we find quite unpleasant. And this ranges from kind of innocuous things like spots to more serious stuff like toxic shock syndrome or necrotizing fasciitis, which is also known as the flesh-eating disease. It also can infect catheters and hospital equipment, and that's usually in the form of the plaque that I mentioned earlier. And so it can cause a real problem, and especially as bad in healthcare institutions. And so it is true that even though bacteria and other microbes do lots of really nice things for us, that's only when they're kept in balance and when they aren't harmed and allowed to proliferate and grow to really big numbers and do just whatever they want to do. So yes, as I talk about how wonderful bacteria are, I do have to acknowledge that every now and then they do something they shouldn't. And on that note, I will break for Esther Francis singing Bacteria. that was Esther singing Bacteria, and you can thank me for that song later on, because on the wild side we like to have music that will not be on every radio show that you hear. So if you weren't listening before the break, you probably now have gleaned that today we're talking about microbes, and actually if you were listening closely to that song and all the lyrics, you kind of will understand what I'm about to talk about, which is microbes in the wild. So before the break, I was talking about how microbes are found within the human body, but of course they're also found in lots of other places, actually pretty much every place outside of the human body as well. And in fact, microbes are responsible for the conditions on our planet, and we have a lot to thank them for because they are the ones that produce oxygen that we now breathe. So about 2.5 billion years ago, cyanobacteria began to produce oxygen as a waste product of photosynthesis. And so these guys now are directly responsible for about half of the oxygen that's available on Earth, and then they're indirectly responsible for much of the rest. So this is partly because of the fact that you've got free-living cyanobacteria, but you've also got chloroplasts, and chloroplasts are cyanobacteria that eventually moved into other cells that then became photosynthetic plants. So microbes are found in a huge array of different ecosystems, and I have a few of these here to talk about very briefly just to kind of illustrate how incredibly varied they are. So one place that's quite out of the way is subterranean caves, and there was a recent study in something, I'm probably going to mispronounce this as well, but Lechuguilla Cave, and this was in the Americas, and there were biologists that recently sampled 93 separate strains of bacteria that had probably never before been exposed to humans prior to this study, and found actually, interestingly, these 93 things that were naive to humans were already resistant to our antibiotics, which is a little bit scary. But it's amazing that these guys could go into a cave that has been there hundreds and thousands and millions of years and find bacteria that we've never seen before. And we are, in fact, constantly coming up with new samples of bacteria. And in fact, another example of that, which is also a good example of the type of extreme environments in which these guys can live, is a recent study in the Antarctic. And they have found in an under-ice lake, they found a huge sample of bacteria that they do believe are probably from that area and not a result of contamination. And these guys probably are eating rocks for minerals, basically. So they're getting things like iron and sulfur out of them, and that's how they're able to get energy to live. And the researchers are going through an extensive process to make sure that there wasn't contamination as they drilled through the ice to get to this lake. But it's looking quite promising, and they're very excited because they think that these sorts of conditions are very similar to those that might be found in places like Saturn, Neptune, Jupiter. So this potentially could indicate to us how organisms might live on planets like that, if in fact there are other living species in our solar system, or even outside of our solar system in planets that have extremes like that. And of course, having listened recently, I'm sure, to every one of my 3 episodes on our solar system, you are aware of the type of environment that is on a place like Saturn or Neptune. But just like those sorts of extreme environments, you do find bacteria living in places like the Antarctic, also in places like volcanoes and hot springs. So for example, there were bacteria that were found in Yellowstone National Park in 1966 that were eventually identified to be a group called extremophiles that like these really ridiculous conditions. You also find them in underwater vents, so places with no sunshine and very high pressure. And so all of these things are studied with quite a lot of interest by biologists who think that there might be life on other planets, and they want to understand how that life could possibly manage to keep itself going. Now amazingly, we also find bacteria floating in the Earth's atmosphere. And one of the reasons for this is that we have a lot of wind activity, which of course you know about from listening to the weather discussion I had last week on Wildside. And wind will kick up bacteria and carry it all around the world, along with dust as it kind of blows from one continent to the next. And so any time that you go out and take a sample, you're likely not just to get the bacteria from the continent that you're standing on, but also from wherever the wind has blown in from. And it's amazing how these guys really make the rounds. And they're found as high up as 22 miles above the Earth's surface, which is pretty amazing, especially since normally the UV radiation should kill them off. But actually there's a lot of evidence suggesting that not only can they live, but they can even reproduce and metabolize and just kind of have fully functioning lives up there in the clouds. And some recent evidence suggests that they might play a very significant role in creating snowflakes and other types of precipitation, but particularly snow. So they are one of the most efficient ice nucleators. And again, if you were listening last week, you'll remember that there are these little particles that are up in the clouds, and the water droplets will start condensing on those and then condensing with each other and picking up more and more until they can eventually become heavy enough to fall. And so it turns out that even better than dust and other types of stuff that, abiotic stuff that's picked up and hangs around in the air, bacteria actually are fantastic for nucleating little bits of water and forming especially snow crystals. Now there are lots of different studies exploring how bacteria live in the wild but near humans, and these are kind of interesting because they give you an idea of kind of the unseen world that you pass every day as you go through your life. So for example, public restrooms are dominated by human-associated bacteria, and the most common ones tend to be those from the gut and urinary tract, or in other words, basically the stuff that we're going to the bathroom to do is getting out, and the bacteria are kind of not just near the toilet but pretty much everywhere in the restroom. And you've also got things from the surface of our skin, which you'd expect because we're touching the surfaces in the restroom while we're in there. And in fact, some researchers performed a biogeographical analysis where they went into restrooms and thought of them as giant ecosystems and looked at where different bacteria were found on all the different surfaces. And they found that there were 3 aggregations of bacteria. So one is on or near the toilets, one is on the floor, and the other is on surfaces touched by hands. So things like door handles and the knobs of the faucets. So several groups, kind of disturbingly, including gut and urine bacteria, were found on all of the surfaces, including those that you normally touch after washing your hands. And I find that that's really interesting because you have all these people that are really obsessed about washing their hands, and then the minute they go to turn off the faucet or touch the paper towel holder to get some paper towels or grab onto the door handle to leave, they're getting all of those bacteria again. And it's not just the regular skin bacteria, but the things that they probably want most to get off of them because they're from the toilet area. And then there's another survey that was kind of a similar type of thing that was done on office environments. And this was performed across 54 different offices in 3 major cities in the U.S. And these guys found out that there were probably about 4,000 different species of bacteria across all of these areas that they sampled. And different parts of the country had very different bacterial levels and also bacterial aggregations. And this suggests that climate has a big effect on the growth, and also that you do have these regional differences because of where the bacteria are coming from and kind of what sort of ecosystem the bacteria find when they emerge and kind of land on people or transfer over to different surfaces. Now, interestingly, they compared the offices of men to those of women, and they also compared the different parts of offices to see where the bacteria were most common. And they found that offices belonging to women had fewer bacteria, so we can gloat a little bit, ladies. But they also found that regardless of what office you're in, phones and chairs tend to be the worst place in terms of exposure, while surfaces like desks and keyboards and mice were a little bit better. So you might actually think that your keyboard or your mouse would be particularly bad for harboring lots of bacteria, but actually it is something like your chair, which tends to maybe hold in the bacteria a bit better. Now, one place that bacteria are quite important is on farms, where they can form relationships with plants that help the plants be healthier or more productive. And this is true not just of the kind of plant species that we're interested in agriculturally, but also wild species as well. And there was a really interesting recent study on soils in agricultural areas in Egypt, where they were looking at places where it had been desert and they've turned it over and made it into farmland instead. And they wanted to compare what was happening in the new farmland versus what had been happening in the desert. And they found that the agricultural areas had much higher bacterial diversity and different types of species than were found in the nearby kind of deserty areas. And many of the farm bacteria were plant-specific, so this indicated that the microbes were forming relationships with the flora, and that's where they were coming from. So maybe they were in just very, very low numbers in the soil, and they were able to latch onto the plants and then proliferate to the point that they could actually be detected in these analyses. And the ecological function of the species was also quite different if you looked at what was happening on the farm versus what was happening out in the desert. So the agriculture type of species, the ones that were common around the plants, were more likely to have antifungal activity. And so that was really interesting because it suggested that the reason these guys were doing so well was that maybe they had kind of a mutualism going on where they were helping the plants in some way and the plants were helping them in some way. So specifically, the plants seemed to be offering them a nice place to sit and live, but they were also offering the plants a bit of protection against potential fungal infection. And what was really cool about this was that it didn't seem like these species of bacteria had been transported in with the plants when the plants were introduced, but in fact they were indigenous species that just shifted in their balance of how many there were and where they were found because they did so well once the plants were introduced. And this suggests that each region can supply its own appropriate microbes, that we have a lot of variation no matter where we go, and that it will kind of just, these communities will shift as these new conditions are introduced to them, which maybe is quite encouraging news when we think about the potential effects of climate change and whether we're going to have to do agriculture in different places in the world and whether we might need to move to different places. So it suggests that there's quite a big reservoir of bacteria and genes available to do the sort of functions that help us out as humans living in these environments. Now streams, of course, also, like terrestrial environments, will have bacteria. And there's been some recent research on impervious surface cover, so things like roads and buildings and other types of human surfaces, to see how these can impact the bacterial communities in streams. And the big concern is that when we have these sorts of human surfaces, they funnel a lot of water flow, and they'll take a lot of organisms from the land and put them in the water, and that might change the dynamics of what's going on. And bacteria are quite important for tasks like denitrification, which transforming toxic nitrate to nitrogen gas, which is not so bad. And this is really important in urban areas where we're introducing lots of nitrogen because of all of our pollutants and all of our pesticides and I'm totally blanking on the word. You know, the things you put, fertilizers, there you go. So we tend to introduce a lot of this stuff that we don't want. And actually they found that despite the fact that we do have all these surfaces that change the bacterial communities, it turned out that actually things are looking pretty good in these streams. So this is quite encouraging because we really need these guys to get rid of the bad stuff in the streams and to keep the toxic metals out, for example. They can help try to filter those things out before they're taken up into tissues of plants and animals. And so it's quite nice to know that even though we are changing lots of things with all the things we do to the environment, we are at least keeping some aspects of the environment healthy thanks to the help of the microbes. And just one last thing I want to mention before I have another song break is something I mentioned a long time ago when I talked about the science of food. So microbes are really important in a lot of the foods that we eat, and a lot of our favorite foods. So they're critical for the formation of beer and wine and bread and pickled items and cheese. So for example, they're responsible for the chemical process that allows solid cheese to form from liquid milk, and that's because they drive the fermentation of lactose, which goes to lactic acid, and then you have the denaturation of proteins and the binding of those proteins into the curds that we eventually eat. And of course microbes also can grow on the inside, so they're responsible for the veins of blue that we see in blue cheese, as well as on the outside, so they form the rinds. It's not just bacteria, but all microbes, so they can form the rinds of things like camembert and brie. And they're responsible for a lot of the unique tastes that we have associated with different types of cheese and cheese from different regions. So a lot of the variation that you have whenever you go to the supermarket and you see all those different varieties, that's because they are made using different conglomerations of microbes. Once it is and that was Monty Harper with Microbe Hunter. You might not be surprised to hear that Monty actually writes songs for children, but I thought that one was pretty amusing and actually pretty accurate, so hopefully you enjoyed that. So I actually have tons of notes that I'm not going to get to today because there are just so many interesting things to talk about when you're thinking of microbes. But I'll just kind of quickly wrap up with one last case of some of the great things that microbes can do for us, and that is the case of bioremediation. So these guys are actually kind of mutualistic, if you like, in the case of bioremediation, because they're helping us and we are helping them. And unfortunately, what we're doing to help them is we are doing bad things to the environment and spilling things that shouldn't be out there. So pollutants like gasoline or oil or other sorts of bad chemicals that aren't doing the environment any good. And we want to get those out of the soil, out of the sediment, out of the water as soon as possible. And one of the things that we can do to help this is bioremediation. So that's the use of microorganisms that metabolize the pollutants and then they break them down and release them as harmless end products, not endless harm products, in their place. So this can involve biostimulation, where we encourage the growth of an indigenous bacterial species, or it can be bioaugmentation, where we add a new species to a contaminated site to do our work for us. Or we can adjust the environment in such a way that we're kind of facilitating either one of these goals. So we can not just alter the bacteria themselves, but also alter the conditions and help them grow. And actually there's a recent study that has been performed in Nigeria at an auto body shop where they took all these samples of the soil that had been just full of oil and grease from the old used motor oil from the cars, and this has been happening for years and years. And they found that indigenous species were very good at getting rid of all of these contaminants, and so they had even tried putting in new species instead, or having both new species and old species, but they found that actually the native species in the soil were very good at this, and all they needed to do was just change the environmental conditions a little bit to encourage the growth of those organisms and to help them kind of pick up the speed with which they got rid of the oil and the grease and the other petroleum hydrocarbons from the soil. And the researchers are now working on, they had done this in quite a small scale, and now they're working on scaling it up so that they can have a really large, basically kind of a holding tank where they just have the right environmental conditions. They chuck in the soil that needs to be fixed, they get everything out of it, and they can put the soil back and keep going. So obviously you would need to eventually work it out so that you had quite a large area to do this, so that you could go through soil as rapidly as possible. But this does seem to be an option for maybe cleaning up areas like around auto body shops, or maybe even eventually places where maybe you have really large-scale environmental catastrophes, so things like the kind of Deepwater Horizon type event that might happen on land instead. So what is the take-home message from all of these things that I'm saying about bacteria and other microbes? Well, I think that we overlook them because they aren't visible, but we have to remember that they are all around us, and even though sometimes they do naughty things, and so we focus on them because they cause colds, they cause the flu, whatever, they also can have neutral effects, or even quite often be very beneficial. So another thing that I want to kind of leave you with is the idea that you should think twice about that antibacterial soap that you might be using to wash your hands. And in fact, many doctors are recently suggesting that you just rinse with water. And the reason for this, not only that we're kind of helping antibiotic resistance evolve where it shouldn't be, but you're also getting rid of the things that are there on your skin doing you a lot of good. And it's good if you can kind of cultivate your own bacteria and keep those guys nice and healthy, because they will help you in the end. So hopefully you can appreciate all the things that they make possible. So things like good food and healthy plant growth and a functioning immune system, and creating potentially green fuels and ethanol and methane and lots of things that we use in our daily lives. So don't revile them, give them thanks, and just to celebrate one last little bit, here I'll leave you with Facing the Mutant Microbe by Whitebear, and it'll run into Stanley's show, so you'll only get to hear a little bit of it, but thanks for listening this week, and I will talk to you next week.